Good afternoon. Thank you. So it is a beautiful afternoon. I wrote this talk as a reproach to mostly white male liberals who willfully read Black Power as illegible nihilism. It's a partial chapter in my new book project, which is tentatively called Black Feelings. It would be difficult to pinpoint a more poignant example of the social and political turmoil of 1968 than Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination in Memphis on April 4th. Marching in solidarity with city sanitation workers, King championed the Poor People's Campaign, but his assassination imperiled a broad movement to end poverty. His Atlanta funeral was one prominent affective and rhetorical space where varying publics contested King's legacy and the future of the movement in the wake of his tragic murder. King's funeral highlighted divergent expectations about the future of the movement, competing assessments of civil rights ideology and strategic political positioning competing as attendants memorialized the fallen leader. Elizabeth Hardwick described the scene from the funeral as one, quote unquote, bathed in memory. In a section that bears lengthy quotation for its emphasis on feeling and its relationship to memory, Hardwick says, "No one could doubt that there had been a longing for the reunion among white ministers and students, the liberals from the large cities, the love-locked arms, the songs, comradeship, all of that was remembered with nostalgia and feeling. This love, if not actually refused, was seldom forthcoming in relations with new Black militants who were determined to break the dependency of Black people even on the energy, cooperation, and checkbooks of the guilty, longing, loving whiteys. Everything separated the old civil rights people from the new militant, even the use of language, the harsh, obscene style, the unforgiving stares, the insulting accusations, and refusal to make distinctions between good whites and bad. This was humbling and perplexing. Many of the white people had created their very self-identity out of these issues and distinctions. They felt cast off, ill at ease with the new street rhetoric of self-defense and self-determination," end quote. The distance between the ministers, white students, and Black Power activists was palpable as each cohort expressed different affective connections to King and to the struggle that he helped to lead as they confronted his absence. Beyond the sentimentality of the white churchgoers is the contrast between the positivity of the memories of white activists and the questions about solidarity with Black militants, whose rejection of both optimism and whiteness marked a shift in both memory and political philosophy. Hardwick's description, though, is part of the problematic rhetorical memory of this moment in the movement, since the Black militants attending the funeral had marched and organized with King. Rather than a completely oppositional relationship, SNCC leaders had a much deeper relationship than King than Hardwick's description admits. For the Black radicals that stayed in the South for the beatings and the jailings and the voter registration drives, this white homecoming feeling described by Hardwick as loved was unwarranted and insulting, with thousands of poor Black people waiting outside of the church to pay their last respects. Additionally, such a description, and they were everywhere at the end of the decade, relies on what Sarah Ahmed has called, quote unquote, a nostalgia for whiteness. In this case, for a whiteness that was an equal partner in the Black freedom struggle. Working against both nostalgia and narrative, SNCC leader Stokely Carmichael remembered King's funeral, highlighting his proximity to King and evoking a deep sense of belonging near the slain leader, saying that although it couldn't be helped, ain't never been so many high up white folk in that church before or since. Celebrities, politicians, powerful white folk up in that church. Hubert Humphrey and Bobby Kennedy were there despite Kennedy having authorized the wiretaps on King, which bothered Carmichael, who recalled, while thousands of poor Black folk were sweating outside in the sun, many of them crying, people who loved him and whom he loved. Greater love hath no man than that who laid down his life. For a moment, I thought we should stand out here with Dr. King's people. Then I saw the important guests all going in, and I said, hell no, ain't nothing gonna keep us out. We belong in there, so we crashed. As someone that marched next to King and arguably radicalized him, Carmichael is clear about the importance of the location of Black radicals in the process of the funeral. He invokes Black feelings at the funeral while also talking about the importance of proximity to King and the hierarchy of the struggle and its historical representation, noting the closeness of indifferent white liberals to King and the separation between King and the poor. My essay argues that Black Power activists like Carmichael used memories of King's assassination to reorient audiences and legitimize Black Power. I explore how King's assassination was used as an instrumental as well as affective rhetorical resource to help shape the memory and direction of the Black Power movement after '68. I argue that King's murder provided context and clarity for Black Power, justifying a more militant and assertive identity for Black activists, and I suggest that King's death calcified an affective shift from Black optimism to Black pessimism. After his assassination, King became, in Michael Schuler's words, an instant martyr, and his death marked a moment of both keening grief and poignant reflection upon his contributions to public culture. The mythification of King prompted intense political struggle over meaning, especially since, as Michael Eric Dyson points out, in Memphis, quote, "It was clearly the time that was on King's mind, and so was death, the time of death, the death of the movement, the death of hope." Publishers and journalists understood King's murder as a repository of competing loyalties and memories about King that needed to be framed. For example, Ebony magazine founder John Johnson reflected on the Black condition in America in '68 in his eulogy to King, writing, "And so we stand today, a nation more divided Black against white than at any time in history. The promise of the March on Washington is dead. Martin Luther King Jr. is dead. Very much alive is a virulent white racism that threatens to destroy not only Black people, but American democracy." Where King is divested from rhetorical power in Johnson's declaration, white supremacy is invigorated as a monumental force of destruction in the days following King's assassination. The death of nonviolence, romanticizing King's dream. If anything, the rhetorical memory work assessing the meaning of King's death has been polysemic and hotly contested. Some of those remembering King after the assassination talk about seeing him and falling in love. For example, Alice Walker writes, "Like a good omen for the future, the face of King was the first Black face I saw on our television screen. And as in a fairy tale, my soul was stirred by the meaning for me of my mission. I fell in love with the sober and determined face of the movement." She adds that King was a kind of wish fulfillment for Black people, saying, "He was the one. He was the hero, the one fearless person for whom we had waited. I hadn't even realized before that we had been waiting for Martin Luther King Jr., but we had." In remembering a virile, heroic King, Walker's romanticizing suggests that optimism was indeed a central part of King's legacy. Lauren Berlant explains, quote, "Any object of optimism promises to guarantee the endurance of something, the survival of something, the flourishing of something, and above all, the protection of the desire that made this object or scene powerful enough to have magnetized an attachment to it." The optimism of King's quest for a nonviolent solution to segregation was heightened by his death, after his death, by Black writers that romanticized him, suggesting that heroic memories of the man would outlive the movement and denying that the movement failed, the ideas would live. But King's own optimism ebbed and flowed, especially after Watts, the disastrous organizing efforts in Chicago, a never-ending war in Vietnam, and massive domestic repression. King's death signaled not only his own mortality, but the death of optimism, as intellectuals proclaimed the death of the civil rights movement. Carmichael recalls, "All over the country, Black people were telling the nation, 'This time you went too far, killing this good, decent man, this man of peace. When you killed King, you killed nonviolence.' Man, all the way to Atlanta, every station that came over the radio, more reports of riots, insurrection, disorder, Black folks signaling to America, 'When you killed Dr. King, you killed nonviolence.'" And this was everywhere, like literally every memory of this moment among Black activists, radical or not, say that the death of King was the death of nonviolence. However, one major problem loomed. As Raphael notes for social movement leaders, quote, "In the rituals of national mourning, the significance of the empty boots is predicated on a paradox. What is irretrievably lost must somehow be replaced. Moreover, in the economy of cultural memory, the more important the social role played by the departed, the more immutable the loss, the more critical that a substitute be found to fill the social cavity filled by the fallen. In memorializing the fallen leader, the ritual of mourning simultaneously and necessarily interpolates a replacement of recapitating a body politic that has literally lost its head. Though impossible, recapitating King's head in the aftermath of the assassination was imperative, particularly for SCLC supporters, since King's dream of nonviolent integration was the idea that had helped win him such broad support. Given that King's dream is functioned as the pathway into the mythology of the slain leader and is an obvious extension of his head, ideas, rhetorical expressions, and tactical decisions, it seems important that we understand King's dream as it was articulated at the '63 March on Washington. There, his dream emerged, as it had in many speeches across the South, as an indictment of white invocations of the so-called American dream. In the oft-played I Have a Dream speech, King decried the failure of emancipation. He impugned the vision of America that ignores the material deprivation of Black America. Acknowledging the Southern violence that Black citizens confronted on a daily basis, along with the jailings that they endured as part of the nonviolent crusade, King reimagined the dream not as an attainable ideal, but as a futurist moment when segregation and racial fear would not characterize any communities in the U.S. But we would be remiss to consider King's dream without also attending to Malcolm X's assessment of the nightmare of white supremacy, especially in the context of civil rights activism in the South. In the classic dialectic, the notions of dream and nightmare competed as contextual frames for understanding the stakes and strategies of the Black freedom movement, where the affective dimensions of hope and despair attenuate the contrast. For example, in The Ballad of the Bullet, Malcolm told Black audiences, "America's conscience is bankrupt. She lost all conscience a long time ago." As a result of this assessment, Malcolm sought to change Black consciousness since he had no hope for changing white minds, and he urged Black people to understand themselves as perpetually alienated from the American dream. Malcolm's comments showcased how King's dream can only exist in a place where the nightmare of Black victimization is rampant, and they demonstrate a resistance to the dream predicated on shifts in white rather than Black consciousness. The death of the man, the death of a movement, from Black optimism to pessimism. While Black intellectuals like Margaret Walker and others joined the chorus proclaiming the death of the movement after King, they also described the death of hope. Many of the memories of King's assassination were critical about assessing any optimism about King himself. For example, Nina Simone described the assassination, calling his murder the traditional white American tactic for getting rid of Black leaders it couldn't suppress in other ways. She added, "For a white people walking around in this kind of days," and I wept along with them, but I couldn't understand why anybody was surprised by Martin's assassination. We'd already lost Malcolm, Medgar Evers, Emmett Till, and hundreds of thousands of others along through the history. For Simone, King's assassination was a desperate act by a country with nowhere to hide anymore. Her comments reflect a rhetorical memory that avoids nostalgia and optimism, articulating instead an affective rhetoric that is more reflective of Malcolm's disillusionment. Her assertion that bitterness was a reasonable response to the sadness of King's murder resists the romantic affective response of other artists. Time magazine also covered the assassination, writing, "Rarely in American history had hope and horror been so poignantly fused in men within a single week." Right? Voluntarily and involuntarily. It seems so ineluctably intertwined. Johnson's announcement of a major peace offensive in Asia, combined with the renunciation of another term, raised anticipation throughout the world that the long agony of Vietnam would be over. Again, we see the contrast between hope and horror here as an active affective frame for King's assassination, while this snippet also points to the war in Vietnam as an essential part of the political context that provided insights into memories of King. Because this framework was so strong, we might expect that all of the Black power rhetorists would completely denounce King after his death, especially because they saw themselves as the heirs to Malcolm. But they didn't. Stokely, for example, used identification as a mode of rhetorical constitution by explaining that all of the people that he worked with, including Julius Hobson, Cecil Moore, Malcolm X, Gloria Richardson, Assata Shakur, Robert Williams, Muhammad Ali, Rap Brown, and even Dr. King himself, all at some point were seen to cross the line the media imposed about responsible Black protest. Writers like Carmichael invited the reader to see King as simultaneously above the movement as martyr and of it as an intellectual kindred, at least partially reclaiming him. Additionally, Black Panther Minister of Information Eldridge Cleaver used King's death to denounce Johnson's repression of civil rights efforts. He explains how the Panther Party was formed in Oakland, writing, quote, "The Panther Party was born under Johnson. Even Malcolm didn't call for the gun until after Kennedy was killed, showing how reactionary violence begets reactionary violence. We asked for our civil and human rights, but instead of getting our rights, we have been killed and jailed and driven underground en masse. Now we ask for nothing. Now we'll take what we want." Tracing the domestic repression of civil rights to Johnson as the catalyst for Panther resistance, Cleaver goes on to explain that the Panthers distanced themselves from Johnson because, in his words, quote, "Both Malcolm and King were killed under Johnson, and Nixon has turned us into a nation of pallbearers and gravediggers. In the almost 10 years since the killing of Kennedy, the official solution to the racial problem has shifted from integration to a policy that approaches apartheid." Cleaver's remarks resituate King's relationship with Johnson in the wake of his assassination, helping readers to understand the shared experience of King's death, to facilitate without judgment King and his legacy, and to situate King within discourses that speak to institutional repression rather than, say, a lone gunman. The rest of the essay talks about cruel optimism as the bridge to Black pessimism, and I'll end there. In the bitterness and harshness of Black Power commentary following King's assassination, we see a shift in rhetoric and affect that moved Black liberation from the cruel optimism of nonviolence to bridled and Black pessimism about white liberals. In the simplest term, cruel optimism refers to the condition of maintaining an attachment to a significantly problematic object. I suggest that King's death shook the Black Power movement because they saw themselves in him, even as they sought to define themselves as apart from him. Because cruel optimism is expressed through the fetishizing of an object or ideal in the case of King himself, or his dream for a nonviolent future, the destruction of that thing or ideal is devastating. And you see this in most of the accounts after King's assassination. The major journals and newspapers were writing about how King's assassination exposed a fault line in American culture that whites did not want to admit to. If the murders of Southern civil rights workers and the assassination of a U.S. president were not enough, King's murder essentially spoke to the death of an era defined by the loss of life, the pronouncements of the end of the movement, and the end of Johnson's presidency. But even as journalists and intellectuals were poised to identify the discontinuities that followed his death, Black Power intellectuals made the opposite rhetorical choice. For Black Power activists, continuity was a major rhetorical goal in asserting memories of King's death. A shallow or cynical assessment of the rhetorical move would see Black Power leaders as agents co-opting King to radicalize him posthumously. I think that's a lazy read. I think we want to see Black Power as an extension of the Southern civil rights movement that only appears disingenuous if readers insist on refusing to acknowledge King's radical legacy and freezing him in time at the March on Washington. The dream was no longer the central motif when King was assassinated, especially because he became more radical on class and on internationalism. The perpetual harassment from the FBI and local police force, especially under COINTELPRO, the sheer numbers of Black activists being shot and killed in unprompted police shootouts, the militantly anti-civil rights posture and Southern strategy of the Nixon administration, particularly in the Department of Justice, and the conservatism of Reagan's law and order rhetoric in California made optimism a foolish, passé, and untouchable feeling for Black activists, especially in 1968. So I want to conclude with the notion that King's death left a striking absence in the rhetorical and political landscape, and it actually guaranteed the emergence of Black Power as a series of rhetorical signs and gestures that shifted the movement in the absence of a White House that was willing to negotiate and a Department of Justice that was willing to protect Black activists. Thank you.